In October 1918, Germany called for an armistice and accepted its terms in November, and so the war ended at 11 a.m. on November the 11th. So the war was ended, but the peace had still to be made. The armistice was only a ceasefire, not a surrender, and the blockade of Germany was continuing, resulting in severe hardship for hundreds of thousands of German civilians, if not millions. But a few things to say about the organization of the peace conference. The conference was held in Paris, the French capital where emotions were most inflamed and where the cries for revenge were the loudest. The defeated powers were not invited to the discussions because they were seen as guilty of causing the war. Nor was Russia invited to the conference. The second of the two revolutions in Russia in 1917 had made it a communist state. In total, 32 states attended the conference, but the key decisions were made by the leaders of Britain, France, and America. And here you see the big three, as they were called. From left to right, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. In the middle, President Woodrow Wilson from America, and then Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. For Britain and France, the treatment of Germany was by far the most important consideration, whilst America was mostly interested in the bigger picture. So we see the difficulty of concluding a treaty that would satisfy everyone. But we are considering whether the treaty was fair or not. And as I have put on the slide, fair would mean that Germany deserved to be treated that way. Fair also suggests an even-handed, balanced judgment, delivered without bias or prejudice. So, the terms of the treaty. Now I begin with the guilt clause because it is the basis for everything else. The reparations, the territorial losses, the military clauses, and membership of the League of Nations. That Germany was seen as guilty justified everything else. So the guilt clause should be at the centre of answers to questions that ask you whether the treaty was fair or not. But whilst Germany was guilty of adding to international tension with its policy of Weltpolitik, and it did give Austria-Hungary a blank cheque in the July crisis, and it did invade neutral Belgium, commit atrocities, commit to unrestricted submarine warfare, and deliberately damage French coal mines. Nevertheless, Germany was not the only country to raise tensions. Germany, or a German, did not assassinate Archduke Ferdinand, and Germany did not mobilize first. In other words, Austria and Hungary, which of course were also found guilty, but also Serbia, Russia, and France, even Britain to some extent, were also responsible for bringing about the war. As for reparations, the dilemma was that whilst France wanted German reparations in order to pay off its loans, Britain needed Germany reasonably economically strong in order to pay off its loans. In other words, Britain needed to trade with Germany. What was decided was a huge sum, £6.6 billion or $33 billion. Take your choice. And massive reparations were being imposed when the ability to pay them was being taken away, territory and people. Was it too much? Germans had suffered immense hardship as a result of the war and Britain's blockade, and with such a harsh treaty, they could see no end to that suffering. Germany had to provide for the families of its war dead who had lost their main wage earner, and for those so severely disabled that they would never work again. The famous economist and advisor to the British government, John Maynard Keynes, recommended only a third of the sum that was actually imposed. On the other hand, Britain and France were heavily in debt, and they had suffered losses as bad as the Germans, so had the same welfare benefits to make. And reparations only represented 2% of Germany's annual production of goods for sale. And of course, we come back to the question of whether Germany was guilty of causing the war or not. So to the territorial losses. As the slide shows, in total it was a considerable loss. 10 to 12% of its land, more than 12% of its population, that's 6 million Germans, and 15% of its farmland, 15 to 25% of its coal fields, and at least half its iron and steel industry. So Germany's loss was considerable. And Germany did lose its colonies as well. Something to bear in mind about the loss of territory, it is so important. It meant the loss of farmland, factories, and mines, but it also meant the loss of people, and the people were workers, consumers, and taxpayers, and so vitally important to the economy. And a really important point to think about, reparation payments would be made even harder with the loss of territory. There really did seem no chance of recovery for the Germans. And so to the military clauses, with, as you can see, severe restrictions imposed. They made France feel more safe, but it left Germans furious as well as humiliated. The treaty left them unable to defend themselves. As for membership of the League of Nations, this was not a major grievance for the Germans, though it was another humiliation. Germany had to prove itself, had to prove it would behave before it would be allowed to join. And it seemed as if the League was only for the winners. So was it a fair treaty? This cartoon suggests it was. It shows a French policeman and a British policeman tying up a pretty rough-looking criminal who represents Germany. He's being tied by the armistice terms, links to the Treaty of Versailles, and it is suggested that he will complain, hoping to have those terms reduced. "You're hurting me," he says. "If I only whine enough, I may be able to wriggle out of this yet." And if you look at the background in the cartoon, you will see that the cartoonist is trying to show the war damage caused by Germany. So a cartoon that suggests the treaty was indeed fair. Or was the price Germany was forced to pay too high? This cartoon is a German cartoon, sending the message that ordinary Germans will suffer for a long time as a result of the treaty. It shows a mother, probably representing a war widow, comforting her children who are starving. They seem to be living in a one-room hovel with only very basic furniture and little sign of food. though you don't see it on this copy of the cartoon. The mother is saying, "When we have paid 1 billion marks, then I can give you something to eat." So, over to you. Was the treaty fair or not? As always, I do thank you for listening, and as always, I remind you to check out my History Made Easier website. I hope there's some useful stuff on there for you. But for now, cheers.